The moment I decided to leave, she looked at me and said something that didn't make sense at all. Not dramatic, not emotional, just quiet. And somehow that made it harder to walk away. I remember the exact afternoon I decided I was done. Not just with the job, with everything around it. The routine, the people, the feeling that every day looked exactly like the one before it. I worked at a small marketing firm in downtown Chicago. Nothing special about it. 20 employees, open office layout, the constant hum of keyboards and half-hearted meetings about creative direction. From the outside, it probably looked like a stable life. Steady paycheck, predictable schedule, normal conversations about deadlines and weekend plans. But inside, I had started feeling something I couldn't quite explain. A kind of quiet detachment. I would sit at my desk, staring at a campaign brief, and suddenly wonder how I had ended up there. Not in a dramatic way, just curiosity mixed with exhaustion. Like waking up in the middle of a movie and realizing you missed the first half. I remember thinking, is this really it? Not that the job was terrible. It wasn't. That was actually the problem. Nothing was wrong enough to justify leaving, but nothing felt right enough to stay. For months, I told myself it was temporary. Everyone goes through phases like that. But the feeling kept growing. Small things started bothering me. Meetings that should have been emails, conversations that repeated themselves every week, the way everyone talked about future goals but secretly hoped nothing changed. I started noticing how often people sighed. One afternoon during a team meeting, our manager was explaining a new strategy for a client campaign. I watched everyone around the table nod. Not because they were excited, because they were used to nodding. That's when the thought appeared clearly for the first time. I could just leave. The idea felt strange, but also relieving. Like opening a window in a room that had been closed too long. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started imagining what it would feel like to wake up without that routine. No morning commute, no identical Mondays, just space. By Thursday afternoon, I had already written my resignation email. It was sitting in my drafts folder. 3 paragraphs, polite, professional. I told myself I would send it before the end of the day. But before leaving, I wanted to grab a coffee from the break room. That's when I saw her, Emily. She worked 2 desks behind me in the office. We had spoken before, but mostly in passing. Small talk about projects, nothing deeper. Emily had been with the company longer than most people there. If anyone represented stability in that office, it was probably her. She was standing near the coffee machine, staring at the little digital screen like it personally offended her. I laughed quietly. She turned and noticed me. "Something funny?" she asked. I shook my head. "Just looks like the coffee machine is winning." She sighed and stepped aside. "Be my guest. Maybe it likes you better." I pressed the button. The machine made a grinding sound that felt unnecessarily dramatic for a cup of coffee. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she looked at me and asked something unexpected. "Rough week?" The question caught me off guard. Not because of what she asked, but because of how she casually asked it, like she already knew the answer. I shrugged. "Something like that." She nodded slowly. "You've been quiet lately." I remember feeling slightly uncomfortable. Not in a bad way, just exposed. I didn't realize anyone had noticed. "Just thinking about stuff," I said. She leaned against the counter and crossed her arms. "What kind of stuff?" For a second, I considered brushing it off, but something about the moment felt strangely honest, so I said it. "I might leave." She didn't react the way I expected. No surprise, no questions, just a small nod. "Yeah," she said. "I figured." That stopped me. "You figured?" She smiled slightly. People look different when they're about to leave. I frowned. What does that mean? She shrugged. They stopped trying to belong. The sentence landed heavier than it should have. I didn't know what to say to that. The coffee machine beeped, and my cup filled slowly. I picked it up, mostly to avoid the silence. So, you think I should stay? She immediately shook her head no. That surprised me even more. Then why say anything? She thought about it for a second. Then she said the thing that stuck with me. You're not leaving because you want something different. She looked directly at me. You're leaving because you think nothing will change. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Because she was right. I hadn't framed it that way in my mind before. But the reason I felt stuck wasn't the job itself. It was the assumption that tomorrow would always look like today. Emily picked up her coffee. I almost left 3 years ago, she added. That caught my attention. You did? She nodded. Same reason. I waited for her to continue, but she didn't. So what happened? I asked. She took a sip of coffee and looked toward the office floor. Someone told me something annoying. I laughed slightly. What was it? She looked back at me. They said, the problem isn't the place. It's the version of you that's been living there. I felt a strange discomfort hearing that. Not because it sounded wrong, because it sounded possible. She continued. I realized I wasn't bored with the job. She tapped the counter lightly. I was bored with the way I was showing up to it. The sentence stayed in the air between us. For months, I had been blaming the environment, the routine, the office culture, the predictable work. But I had never considered that maybe I had become predictable too. Emily checked the time on her phone. Anyway, she said casually, leaving isn't bad. She started walking toward the door. But it's weird when people leave without questioning their assumptions first. She stopped for a moment, then added quietly, sometimes nothing changes because we stop changing. And then she walked out. I stood there holding a cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. My resignation email was still sitting in my drafts. For the first time that week, I didn't feel certain about sending it. Not because Emily convinced me to stay. She hadn't even tried. What she did instead was disturb a story I had been telling myself. The story that said the environment controlled everything, that progress only happened somewhere else, that change required escape. I went back to my desk and opened the resignation email. I read it again. It sounded reasonable, logical, but something about it suddenly felt incomplete, like it was based on a conclusion I hadn't fully examined. So instead of sending it, I closed the draft. The next morning, I walked into the office with a slightly different mindset. Not excitement, just curiosity. What would happen if I stopped acting like someone waiting to leave? The change was subtle at first. I started asking different questions during meetings, not to challenge people, but to understand things better. I volunteered for projects I normally would have ignored. I spoke to coworkers I had quietly categorized as background noise. And something interesting happened. Not immediately, but slowly. The environment I thought was fixed started reacting differently. Conversations became less automatic. People shared ideas they hadn't mentioned before. A project I joined ended up changing the direction of one of our major campaigns. None of it was dramatic, but it was different. And that difference forced me to admit something uncomfortable. The place hadn't been as static as I believed. I had. Emily never asked if I stayed because of that conversation. In fact, we barely mentioned it again. A few months later, she left the company herself. When I asked why, she smiled and said something simple. Now I actually want something different. And somehow that made perfect sense. Looking back, I realized she didn't stop me from leaving. She just helped me notice the assumption behind my decision, that everything around me had already reached its final form. But human environments rarely work like that. Workplaces, relationships, communities, they reflect the energy people bring into them. And sometimes the quietest realization is this: we're not stuck inside our environment. Our environment is often responding to the version of us that shows up every day. That afternoon in the break room didn't change my life overnight, but it changed one important thing: the way I think about decisions. Because sometimes the urge to leave isn't about the place at all. It's about the quiet belief that nothing inside it can still surprise us. And maybe the real question isn't, should I go somewhere else? Maybe the real question is, what might change here if I did?